to everybody for having not really watched the calendar very well in doing this. If you love this today, and I know you will, and you want to see some of the ones that you might have missed, go to our website, go to the RiverLink YouTube channel, and you can catch a whole bunch of them in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, the prospectus goes out to,
Yes! We're done!
well, we're done with the prospectus. It goes
Okay.
out, it goes out to, I'm gonna try Duke University Press. Jim, questions that you had at the end of last class, I've been waiting a month to tell you this stuff. Because I went back and checked my data. And I forgot to bring the notes, but it's something like this. Climate change. Almost all biologists say the catastrophe level is 3 degrees centigrade, 1.7 degrees, no, excuse me, 2 degrees centigrade, which is about 3.7 Fahrenheit, right? To hold climate change below that level, i.e. to keep it into major problems, but maybe not catastrophe. We must limit CO2 emissions to 565 gigatons over the next 40 years. Okay. If we can, that's the new target. The old target was 350 parts per million. We've overshot that already. We're going to have problems. This is catastrophe. If taking the fossil fuel industry's numbers of all of the fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, these are the known reserves, and then all now the past few years we've heard of all this non-conventional sources, shale oil, shale gas, tar sands, taking all of that. If they want to tap and drill and refine, if we do that and burn it, we produce 2,700 and something gigatons. Okay? So, in other words, this is about 20% of this, right? We have got to avoid climate catastrophe. 80% of all the known fossil fuels have got to stay in the ground.
Is there a technology on the horizon for sequestering carbon?
There is a technology. Yes, the answer is yes. They're talking about opening up a coal plant. All right, that would capture CO2 and inject it into wells. A, still hasn't been proven. B, it's going to drive up the cost astronomically. I mean, this is not going to be cheap anymore. Okay, so so what we might do is we might be able to do that, but then you're probably talking about, well, you're talking about probably gasoline, or coal, or electricity that's going to be much more expensive. There was a report from Climate Science came out yesterday on CO2 emissions, and the good news is the industrial societies have in fact reduced their CO2 emissions by 3.5% over the past 4 or 5 years. Now that gets us down. So that gets us down to the 2004. We are now emitting about as much CO2 as we did in 2005.
That's in the United States.
Industrial nations.
Industrial nations.
Okay.
But Frank, isn't the reality, no matter what we do, the cost of energy is going to go up?
Yes.
If we're going to do it right, you got to pay more.
Yes. And
And people just have to decide to pay more.
The answer is yes. And the answer is to get to that technology. To get to that technology, you're going to have to impose some either cap and trade system on fixed sources. to get, I mean, I think your answer is yes, there's probably some technology out there to re-inject CO2 into the ground. It's not going to be cheap, and the coal companies aren't going to do it unless there's some incentive. I mean, they've either got to be incentivized or they've got to be regulated. They've got to be told they've got to. Because as long as they can keep putting it in the air for free, I don't know why it would be irrational for them not to, sir.
But in the transport sector, how are you gonna capture the carbon?
Exactly. So there's two things. There's fixed sources. Basically, we're talking about electrical power plants. And there's mobile sources, transportation. The way you deal with the fixed sources is through some sort of cap and trade system. The way you deal with the mobile sources is some sort of tax on carbon. You get the price of gasoline so high that people, that people are going to, all of a sudden, electric cars start seeming cost effective when you're paying $8 a gallon for gas. And those two things are obviously, both of those things are being heavily fought. Now,
but that decrease has been in the industrial nations, and the emerging nations essentially are taking up the slack.
yes, absolutely.
And we got to come up with some solution to help them.
Yes. They cannot repeat our process of industrialization.
No, but it's going to be up to the industrial nations to
take
recognize
that
the
co-
problem
to take that
and help
technology
them
and basically sell it
to be able to continue to grow, but without the contamination of the environment
yes,
that we did.
yes. So these are the numbers. All right. Your question, the question I got was this 565 gigatons. The United States right now produces 7 gigatons per year, okay? And the world currently produces, I think, about 31 gigatons a year. So you see, we're gonna hit that 565 gigaton number long before 4 years.
Oh, yeah.
All right, your question was, it bugged the hell out of me even more than who's the guy. Your question is, was this all burning of fossil fuels? Do you remember asking that? Please say. And the answer is, no, it is, what it is, it's all human-caused CO2 emissions. In other words, it does not count decomposing plant life and things like this. What it counts is basically burning fossil fuels and agriculture. Okay? There. My conscience is clear. At least for that one.
Well, didn't you say last month that methane was an even bigger problem than CO2?
Methane's a real issue, thank you. Methane burned, if you burn methane, you get a lot less CO2 per energy output. That's why, for instance, I think one of the ways that we got this 3.5% decrease in CO2 emissions is coal plants, or electric plants are shifting from coal to gas, to methane or natural gas like mad. And it's that shift that's causing the decrease, I think, in CO2. Or at least one of the major reasons, more efficient cars probably. Yes, so CO2, so natural gas when burned is much, quote, cleaner. The problem is unburned, pure methane is 70 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. There's the issue, all right? So if you switched to, say, T. Boone Pickens' idea of switching to basically a natural gas economy, it's going to have to be virtually perfect as far as leakage, byproducts and stuff like this. That same report, that said yesterday came out a federal district court upheld EPA's authority to regulate CO2 as a greenhouse gas, as a quote, dangerous substance. And the same report is now, they're starting to write a report on methane. And one of the issues they're dealing with is leakage. I mean, you know, you do the math, if it's 70 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2, then if like 3% of it leaks, you've nullified the benefits of it burning cleaner. And then of course the one that terrifies me, I mean, this is when I go from depressed to panic, is methane hydrate. That's all the methane that's trapped in the ice of the tundra. And that is a quantity that nobody's, you know, if the tundra melts and all of that methane gets released, and then there's even more methane hydrate in the bottom of the oceans.
Why is there so much methane in the tundra and frozen? Is it permafrost? It's in the permafrost?
It's in the permafrost. It's the expulsion of gas from trillions and trillions of
Bacteria.
bacteria and termites and things like that. And before it got in the atmosphere, it got frozen. And, you know, a little bit of it, I guess, falls every. But I think I told you, for those of you who weren't there, this was one of those mind-shaking moments for me. When these scientists are, have you seen this now? They're walking across the ice in like Russia or something, and they just take an iron stick and jam it in the ground and take a lighter and light it, and flame shoots up out of the ice. And then they take the then they take the stake. I mean, they're not doing it, it's just ice, and jam it into the hole, and the flame goes whoosh, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of that stuff up there. Enough that you can burn it. You can burn the ice.
What does it mean when it says potent? Now, 70% more potent than, how do they measure that? It's just that.
Dan, you're a biologist. Help me here.
I actually wasn't.
Oh, I thought.
So I just
That has to
read
do
that.
with what's called forcing. If you add so much CO2, you're gonna result in trapping heat to a certain extent.
Right.
Okay? So if you add something else in CO2 and it traps a whole lot more heat,
Yeah,
by
that's
volume,
how-
it's more potent.
It's 70 times more efficient.
It's the
than
greenhouse.
CO2.
It's the green. I mean,
Yeah.
what's the most abundant greenhouse gas? And the answer is water vapor.
Right, yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean, actually per volume, probably CO2 is not that much. But it's the one that we're affecting. It's the one that we're tipping. As far as a greenhouse gas, as far as the ability to reflect back heat into the atmosphere,
Yes.
methane, that's what I mean by more potent. Okay, as I understand it.
And you got your beef production worldwide too.
Beef for, I mean, yeah,
That's a big one.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that was, you know, part of Jim's question was, you know, how much of that is burning of fossil fuels, and how much of it is, I mean, agriculture isn't burning fossil fuels, but it's releasing a lot of stuff. Well, what I talked about last time was, these were the challenges we face, and some of the connections we face. Dealing with, there may be technological solutions to deal with carbon or CO2 sequestration, but then we have to talk about the economic connections to that. What would be the economic connections of quadrupling everyone's electric bill?
Devastating.
You know, what would be the economic consequences of, you know, getting the price of gasoline up to $7 a gallon? Although one of the things I hope you're all are also paying attention to, we're told that we have this abundant oil from shale and tar sands. Crude oil, West Texas Intermediate crude oil closed at 104 and change on yesterday. That doesn't sound like, yeah, it may be abundant, but it isn't gonna be cheap.
That's right. All those unconventional.
And I'm not, and if this is the case, and of course, here's the key, here's the other thing is, if we keep 80% of these fossil fuels, I mean, the people, one of the things you have to, the people running these fossil fuel industries are not idiots. I mean, they're very intelligent, I guess in many cases, I used to tell my students, they're probably your parents in some cases. You know, they're not bad people. But they've got these reserves, and these reserves are corporate assets. You tell them you can't tap those corporate assets, and BP and Shell and Exxon are going to go belly up, or at least their stock is going to take a, you know, you tell them you got to write off 80% of your asset, or you know, these assets are going to go down the tubes. So I mean, I think you got to see these connections. You just can't say, you know, we're going to stop burning fossil, or you know.
Pushes them into renewables.
Well, it does, and I think that, you know, obviously to some extent they're starting to see that, but I don't think they could easily deal with the consequences of keeping 80% of their proven reserves in the ground. That would be, and I mean, you know, look, they know this stuff. They're not fools. They know that. And they also know the consequences of it. I mean, I think, you know, I always said the conservatives tend to be blind to the science and the liberals tend to be blind to the economics.
Well, wouldn't that be, you know, if you were running a company and 80% of your assets, future assets and reserves, wouldn't that be great incentive to do a lot of R&D to figure out how to use those more efficiently and cleaner? And it's not.
Oh, and I'm sure they're doing it.
Well, Jim, I mean, you're ex-general counsel for a major oil company. You follow this really closely. You drive an electric car. Is that your impression, that the oil companies are putting money into R&D to figure out how to do this?
No.
Yeah.
Shell has stopped. They were, and they've stopped all that now.
Well, I think what they're doing, help me here, what they're doing is simple cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, what they're doing is how much of it is going to cost us to transfer from fossil fuels to renewables? Will we be able to generate as much income? Will we be able to generate as much electricity? All right, and you know, the alternative is how much will it cost us to support you know, quote, scientists, academics, politicians who say this isn't a problem. And you know, and which is the, because you know, I talked about those other there's the federal court, district court decisions on letting EPA regulate CO2 emissions. The other big case last week was the McCutcheon case, which says now there are no limits on total contributions that rich individuals can give. Are those two decisions connected? Yeah. Yeah. Because the same time that they're saying this, you know, I mean, they're pounding. We all see them. You know, natural gas solves all of our energy problems. You know, we can make clean coal with carbon sequestration. Yeah, you can, but you haven't built any plants to do it.
A few years back, quite a few, there was a lot of attention on the subject of energy independence. And so you're a political scientist, I think. So, and now all of a sudden, you know, we don't kind of hear much about that from the liberal wing of the body politic. It seems like there should be a better, so it's more the conservative who's arguing energy independence. It seems like it would be good to engage this issue in some way.
Yeah, how much energy are we capable of producing? What I'd like to see is how much energy do we really need? You know, I mean, what, you know, how much, what are the goals? You know, what would a realistic situation look like? And this gets me into really today's topic. Because, I mean, we could talk a long time about the science and about the connections. And as you rightly point out, I mean, I try to understand this stuff, but it's not my expertise. My expertise is in government. I don't like to call myself political science. It ain't a science.
Neither is medicine.
I'm pleased to tell people my degree is not in political science, it's in government. This is what my book is about, something I know about. What is the capacity of the American political system to respond to these things? Right, I mean, how well equipped is our system to respond, to come up? And the answer to that, the answer to that requires an understanding of three things. First, it requires an understanding of politics. Secondly, it requires an understanding of policy, how policies get formulated. And third, I'm not a huge Al Gore fan, but Al Gore said, you know, we have the technology. Your point on carbon. Al Gore said we have the technology. We have the technology to solve climate change. We have the technology to solve all these things. He says the only thing we lack is political will. Now, of course, my comment to Al Gore is if this is the critical factor, then why didn't you write a book about political will?
Well, write to him.
Well,
I've got a better idea. I wrote the book about political will.
Yeah. Get him to write the
But then you
forward.
better run for office.
No. So half my book is about politics and policy, and half of it is about political will. Okay? Yeah.
Just a quick question, isn't there a fourth dimension, and that is if you're talking about a worldwide problem, don't you have to add what are the rest of the countries doing?
I think so, and that, I don't know if I have the second book in me. But I think, first of all, I think you're correct. I mean, but I also think that as Americans, the bad news is we're a major part of the problem. The good news is we're gonna be a major part of the solution. Now, I think you're right. China, for instance, China has now outstripped us as total greenhouse gas emitter.
We're number 2.
And we're number 2, except if you go per capita, then we're still number 1. But yeah, and I think these, and I'm beginning to see that, you know, somewhere in the conclusion I have to say, you know, well, I can't write a book about the whole history of the whole world.
Well, that's true, but, you know, just sitting back saying, if you address that just at Americans,
Yeah.
the Americans would say, well, hey, why should we go through all this pain and suffering if the rest of the world's not gonna jump in?
And the answer, I guess you say, the answer could be because it's the right thing to do. Because it's the one thing that we can control.
But if you look at the problem set, if we do something, how much effect is that gonna have on the problem set?
Well, and the answer is, we're 4% of the world's population. We're 25% of the consumption, and we're 25% of the pollution. So the answer is we can have a tremendous impact.
And how
We
do you
can slow it
define
down.
pain and suffering? I mean, we're so spoiled. I mean, even with a limited income,
Yeah,
I'm
that's
still
that's
very
going
spoiled.
and the other point I brought out, is, you know, figure it out. If we're 4% of the world's resources, and 4% of the world's population, we're consuming yearly 25% of the world's resources. And let's say what percentage, and we're, you know, our level of affluence is shared by what percentage of the world, you know. To get the rest of the world up to our level would take the resources of another, this plus another 2.5 planets.
Name an example of the United States getting out in front of a major, very significant problem anytime from the creation of the Constitution, when slavery was a major problem,
Good
which
point.
we
Good point.
finessed in the Constitution, and we finally solved it with a war.
Mm-hmm.
It got bad enough, there was a war.
Mm-hmm.
So give us some examples of other times when the United States politically has had the political will to confront a national or international problem in advance of a crisis.
And 2 comments, all right? 1, I can't. There is none. Not to mind that there is none. And 2, it was interesting that you pointed out since the writing of our Constitution. Our Constitution is built upon, one of the premises is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Which means you don't address a problem until it's a crisis.
But didn't we get out in front of, like, health and safety? I mean, average lifespan of Americans since the 1900s to now is doubled or almost tripled.
Yeah, we did. You know how we did it?
We passed laws and cleaned up.
We
the
ignored the
environment.
Constitution.
Trure. But you said, is there an example?
Oh,
Yes,
yeah,
there's an example.
And the examples we pick are going to illustrate this, and it's also going to illustrate this. All right. I mean, we did it. I'm, as an American, very proud of our system of national forests and national parks. All right, and we've probably preserved more nature than any than any country on. I write my little checks to. I'm a big Civil War buff. Man, if they got a chance to buy some land over in Bentonville, here's my check. And that was done by the Antiquities Act. And Theodore Roosevelt, I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell of the Antiquities Act passing today. I don't think there's a chance of NEPA passing. Huh?
Already got it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about these 3 things. Okay. This politics is different. What is politics? All right. There's 2 definitions of politics. There's the classic definition of politics. The classic, by I mean the Greek and the Roman. Politics had to do with the polis. It had to do with all those things that were public. It was what was opposed. It was what was differentiated from your private individual life. Politics was all the things that affected the community. It was a good thing. Someone that was not involved in politics was not a good citizen. Okay, that changed with the writing of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Politics became redefined as the struggle for power. Politics became the battle over what we were going to do about what. And that's when politics, I think, started to get a negative connotation. It's the control over the agenda. But the agenda is this list of items that we've decided we've got to talk about. Okay? Policy is what are you going to do about it? Does that make sense? So each agenda is going to have a different policy set for it. And the most power you can have, the biggest power you can have, is keep something off the agenda. I spent 30 years of my life trying to talk about moving towards a no-growth economy. And the sort of policies that would take and the sort of thing. You can't even get, forget getting a Democrat or Republican to talk about it, because they see economic growth as the solution to everything. The really sad part for me was getting colleges and universities to talk about it, getting economics departments to talk about it. I think I've told this story. I had one of my students at Tulane go to his economic professor and say, do you think it's possible to have exponential growth on a finite planet? His economics professor answered by saying, we're not going to talk about that.
We just- yeah,
And I
yeah,
said, well, maybe it wasn't an important topic. He says, oh no, all we talk about is economic growth. And I said, well, if all you talk about is economic growth, shouldn't you talk about whether or not it's possible? I delivered a lecture to the Tulane Political Science Department. Something, so long. And I turned to one of my colleagues and I said, the issue of economic growth came up, and I said, do you think it's possible to have exponential growth on a finite economic growth, by which, exponentially increasing 4% per year, 4% of what? Of last year. That's exponential. Of output of goods and services forever? Do you think it's possible? And I'll never forget this. He looked at me and he never answered my question, but I could see it in his face. He would look at me and said, you're out of here.
You're shaking up the status quo.
You're out of here. And he was right. I mean, I had my students go online, go to your alma maters, and see how many of your alma maters teach courses in ecological economics, which is no good, And if you didn't graduate from Middlebury, University of Vermont, maybe Maryland, Oberlin, if you did, you're very fortunate. or Wharton. You probably didn't. It wasn't that it was debated and rejected. It wasn't even debated. And I think that's a big difference. So environmental politics is that fundamental struggle over the agenda. Have I driven that home? And the fundamental struggle over the agenda can divide environmental politics into two groups. One group that I will call mainstream environmentalists think that we can somehow address these issues without fundamentally changing our political system, our economic system, or our ethics. There's nothing wrong with the Constitution, free market capitalism, or what I will call individualistic humanism, right? And we can still solve it. The environment are threats to the system, not threats by the system. The other group are the radical environmentalists. These are groups that say, no, it's the political system of self-interested individualism. It's the economic system. And I don't know a single economist that will not recognize that capitalism depends on economic growth. We could get into why. But that is a universal given. Right? If that's no longer, and that universal given assumes a world of infinite resources, infinite sinks, a world of no limits, a world that, unfortunately, we don't live in. So it's this big split that really defend, and obviously these people are well in control. These people define, if you ask them to defend themselves, I think they would say, I know. They say, this is the only response that's practical. This is the only response that you have a shot of getting implemented into policy. Right? But there's a different definition for practical. Practical means feasible, means you can get it implemented. But practical also means it's workable. It would be effective. And, I mean, these people, some of them are my friends, don't think they're being impractical. They're just defining practicality different. So here's the problem we face. What we can get implemented might not work, and what would work, we might not be able to get implemented. See that? The solution, obviously, is somehow we need to do both. We need to have mainstream environmental policy to, like you say, slow it down. It's not gonna solve the situation. And it's not even gonna stop it from getting worse. But it's gonna make the rate at which it gets worse slower. I mean, that's why we need NEPA. That's why we need the EPA. That's why we need the Southern Environmental Law Center. They're not gonna solve our environmental problems, right? But they're gonna slow the process of destruction down. We gotta be realistic. We gotta be realistic about the potential of our political system and our economic. Solving the problem, we've gotta start talking about what real solutions would look like, and that's gonna be changing our economic system, our political system, and our ethics.
Could you tell us what on the radical side, what are some of the operative principles
Yeah,
for
I sure can.
distribution of wealth
Yeah.
and capital
Yeah.
and goods?
I sure can. I wish I could come up with a different word, because radical since
Yeah,
9/11.
it just all-
As 9/11 has such a terrible connotation, but that's what it, I use it in the sense.
Practical.
Well, I use it in the sense, my mother had radical breast surgery. What does that mean? I mean, it doesn't mean, it was performed by Al Qaeda. It means it went to the roots of the problem. You can come up with, let's talk about mainstream environmentalists. Let's talk about mainstream environmental politics. Let's remember, I think I'm slant the other way. I'm gonna move from the left to the right, but actually we're moving politically from the right to the left. The biggest group are the cornucopians. Or as John Dryzak calls them, the Prometheans. These are the people who say, we have no environmental problems. There's no such thing as scarcity. If you're looking for a buzzword, the buzzword is no limits. I once had my students, tell me how many times you get told. I had students walk around the campus with shirts that said no limits. Right? Professors saying, you can be anything and do anything you want, sir.
Well, getting back to the technology thing.
Yeah, that's the Promethean side.
Yeah, you say we have limited resources, but that's not, to me, I hear that, to me that's not obvious at all. I mean, the greatest example is the one you've already used, the shale gas and oil. I mean, who would have dreamt, I was in the natural gas regulation 15 years ago, who would have dreamt that we'd be swimming in natural gas today? So since we, in our lifetime, see that kind of technological change, it's easy to believe it'll happen again.
These are the people who say, you've done a very good job of articulating that concept, right? There's no scarcity. Technology, whatever problems come along, technology will solve. I mean, the counter argument is, but every time we invent one of these technologies, there's unintended consequences. We're just beginning to wonder what some of the consequences of fracking are going to be. We know what some of the consequences of mountaintop removal are. We know what deep well oil drilling is doing. So there's unintended consequences. There's also technology, I think, Karen's point, can make us more efficient. And that's obviously true. But you have this thing called Jevons paradox. The problem is that the more efficient we become in using resources, the more of that resource we use. And the other problem is, I think, technology can help solve a lot of these top problems. Technology can also create a lot of problems. There is this thing called a nuclear bomb. How and technology cannot make those choices about which technologies to use. See that? Mm-hmm. I mean, technology, your previous example. Technology, I think, possibly, I'm only giving the benefit of the doubt, can produce methods of sequestering carbon. Okay? Technology can also produce the massive campaigns that say we don't have to worry about it at all. In order to, I know this, in order to have that sequestration of carbon, you're going to have some regulations that require them to do it. Okay? So either you have the technology to do it, or you have the technology that says, fight the regulations. It's a cap and tax system. Which technology does this country use? And can that choice be made technologically? The answer is no. That's not a choice that technology makes. That's a choice that citizens make, which technologies to adopt. And I think people like Al Gore are very optimistic. I mean, many environmentalists are very optimistic about technology's future. So Cornick, I mean, you can list these people. In fact, I will. I mean, it's the Heritage Foundation. It's Fox News. It's
Dick Cheney.
Oh gosh, Jim Imhoff, Senator Michael Crichton, Fred Singer, and Patrick Michaels are the two most famous climate change deniers. And their policy formulations are clear. Fight environmentalism. And not only is technology available, environmentalism costs jobs, which is probably also in some ways true.
Well, it's also an attack on your freedom and liberty.
It's an
Your
attack on your
property, how you can handle and control
sure.
your property.
And their policy recommendation. I mean, unfortunately, we have an abundance of examples here in our own state. We have, clearly, this is Pat McCrory. This is our Pope. Okay, this is their policy recommendations are clear. It is now. You will lose your job in North Carolina if you're a state employee and use the words climate change in official document. 5 biologists, 6 I think, that were working on the Natural Heritage Foundation and were dealing with endangered species were all dismissed from their jobs last month. We do not talk about endangered species. We do not talk about climate change in North Carolina. These are the policies, and they're being put into practice. With sludge ponds, and coal-fired plants, we're just beginning to find out what that was about. So these are people who see the major environmental problem is environmentalists. Okay, I don't think it's unfair to call them anti-environmentalists. They believe the major problem are fear-mongering environmentalists perpetuating a hoax. And we'll hold it. The next group is an interesting group. These are the free market libertarians. This is Ron Paul, okay? The Ayn Rand Institute. Whereas they're very similar in as much as they want to it's here, Dan. These are the people that see this as an attack on individual liberty. Private property rights, individual liberty. But whereas these people, there's a slight difference in it. Maybe it's a difference without a distinction. But these people say that there is no such thing as scarcity. These people say everything's scarce. Everything's scarce. But the way you deal with scarcity is to use the market. To put a price on it and see the free capitalist market is the best invention in the history of the world for determining what people want and how much they want it. So, if you want to preserve the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? Simple. Put it up for sale. If the oil companies want it more, they'll bid more. If the environmentalists want it more, the Nature Conservancy or some other groups will raise the money and they'll buy it. But what we must do, their policy is, what we must do is get rid of the national parks, get rid of the national forests, privatize them, and repeal environmental regulations, okay? And let the market deal with all of this. The reason, why are coal companies might be wanting to shift to this new technology, but the market's telling them don't do it because you're going to drive up the cost. Which of course it will.
The market isn't also going to take or change anything until it's a crisis as well.
No. According to the free market libertarians, I mean, I haven't heard Rand Paul use the word market failure very much.
Right.
In fact, I've never heard him use it. All right. The market, and I think I'm not sure that the market will adjust. That's what markets do.
Yeah, but the market doesn't have any incentive to adjust until you hit a point in which, the market's slumping. It's like the
yeah. If it ain't fixed, don't break it. How do you know it's broken? The market will tell you it's broken. The market. Yeah, if the market isn't slumping, why would you fix it? You see, I'm playing devil's advocate. Everyone understands that. Okay? I mean, obviously, what percentage of American public do you think is encompassed in these two groups? 80%. Okay. During the 1970s, though, with the birth of the so-called Green Decade, we got something new. We got reform environmentalism. Reform environmentalism is a shift from economics to law. All right? It's saying these practices not only aren't economically efficient, they're morally wrong. You can't poison people. Okay? You can't pump toxics into the air. And their solution, so they see this as basically an ethical issue of pollution. Okay? And they see it, and the way they're going to deal with it is through a process the way they deal with so many other things: command and control, direct regulation. They're going to pass laws. And so the 1970s got a whole series of legislation, starting with NEPA, all right, National Environmental Policy Act. Then you had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. You had the whole series of alphabet legislation dealing with Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. These are still all basic laws. Then you had Superfund, okay? And you had all of these passed, and it was going to be regulation, regulation, regulation. These people were screaming, "You're interfering on our liberty." These people are saying, "We're protecting the environment." See this? In 1980, of course, everything changed with the election of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was deeply influenced by the cornucopians and the free marketeers.
But Nixon was president when we did the EPA.
Nixon created the EPA.
Yeah.
Now, I have never spoken a good word about Richard Nixon. I'm not going to start today. I mean, the reason was Richard Nixon could see their handwriting on the wall. Richard Nixon was facing what he thought might be a tough battle from Ed Muskie of Maine, who was staunchly in favor of reform environmentalism, was gonna put environmentalism on the agenda. See this?
So it was a defensive move.
It was a defensive move, in my opinion. Okay? When Reagan got elected, Reagan said Americans are overtaxed and overregulated. And he was out to do something about it. Okay? And so Congress managed to pass Superfund like days. I mean, they passed it between the time when Reagan was elected and when he was inaugurated, and Carter signed it like January to get it through because he had a veto pen ready on him. Okay. The question became, well, what are you going to do about the environment then? Are you going to do nothing about it? We do have water clean energy, and the answer was they came up with a solution called environmental economics. Now, this is what gets taught in our colleges and universities today. Okay? Environmental economics still holds to all the basic principles of mainstream economics. Okay? Still believes in economic growth, still believes in technology, still believes in all this. But environmental economics is willing to admit that there's some problems that the market does not deal with. And one of the big things, they came up with this term called externalities. What the market will do is if you can take the cost of treating your CO2 or your particulate matter and just throw it up the chimney for paying no cost, why wouldn't you do that? All right? I mean, from an economic point of view, not dealing with pollution, pump it into the stream. You know, build higher stacks and blow it over in North Carolina. That's the rational choice, and you cannot expect these people to act irrationally. So they understood that in fact, environmental economists define almost all pollution as externalities. And the solution to it was not to do away with the market, but to, and the phrase was over and over again, we're going to internalize the externalities. Okay? We're going to put a price on pollution. And when companies find it cheaper to put scrubbers and precipitators on their smokestacks, when that becomes the cheapest alternative, rather than just letting it go up the stack, they'll do it. Okay? Maybe you might need a little bit of this too. You know, if you put a price on CO2 emissions that was high enough that pumping it into the ground, capturing the CO2, condensing it, and then putting it back into the ground became cheaper, what are the companies going to do?
Now, do they believe in interjecting tax to make that happen?
How the way that you do these things, the way you internalize the externalities, is through, in fact, taxing pollution. The slogan becomes polluter pays. Okay.
Or you create a marketplace for.
And then their biggest solution is you have these tradable discharge permits, which they started off with SO2, and you say, you know, the government will give you so many permits, or sell you so many permits. It works well either way, and every time you emit so much SO2, you have to turn in a permit. Okay, now if the end of the year comes along, and you've run your operation more cleanly, you've got extra permits. You know, Grubbiness Incorporated down here has not done a good job. It's now November. They're out of permits, and they still have to keep up. They have to come to you and buy the permits. The permits become and today. So today, SO2 permits are traded and sold on the Chicago Commodities Exchange. And as a result, the cleaner you operate your business, the more money you make. And the environmental economists are saying, see, it works, okay? These four are basically the main thrust of it. But then in 1987, now to your point, in 1987, it became clear that this was merely these were the major responses, but they were almost purely domestic responses. It became necessary to look at this in a global perspective. And in 1987, the United Nations produced, it was named after, it was headed by Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Brundtland, and it was always called the Brundtland Commission. And the new approach became sustainable development. And if you haven't heard the word sustainability, you've been living in a hole for the past 20 years. Okay. Sustainable development argues there's a difference between good growth, they don't use the term dumb growth, but it's dumb growth, and what they call smart growth. Okay. Smart growth is, according to them, is growth that's managed by the political system. Okay, this is capitalism in the sense it's private ownership of production, but it's capitalism that's managed, regulated, controlled by the public entities, either government, non-government organization. Usually some. The big word became collaboration. These approaches, especially reform environmentalism, was seen as being very adversarial. The lawyers were the good guys, the corporations were the bad guys. Sustainable development, you had a lot of corporate executives coming out and saying, wait a minute, we're good guys too. We want to protect the environment too. And so the big word became collaboration, consensus building, working towards alternative compliance agreements. Okay? What we're going to have is in 1990, Congress passed the Pollution Prevention Act. No regulations whatsoever. My students read this and say, there's no penalties in this. And that's right. It's all carrot and no stick. But if your company has got some new technology that it might be able to reduce, might be allowed to meet these standards, the government will give you research funding grants. Let you tap into some of this other stuff. Provide incentive structures. So, sustainable development became the new buzzword. I mean, this is the World Watch Institute. This is Al Gore. This is Fareed Zakaria. This is Thomas Friedman, the hot, fat, and crowded. This is Charlie Rose. All right? This is the new liberal watchword. We can have, Charlie Rose, do you watch Charlie Rose? How much does he talk about? Every economic problem in the world can be solved with more economic growth. Okay? But it's got to be smart growth. And now, this goes back a long time. It's called, the name of the economic system is called corporatism, where you have for those of us that were raised during the Cold War, we were raised to believe that there's two systems, capitalism and socialism and communism. But there's a third alternative. Much older than both, much older than either capitalism or socialism. Mercantilism was a system where you had private property and public management. Now we call it, some of these people are called neo-mercantilists, probably not unfairly. Mixed economic systems, managed capitalism, mixed. They come up with all these sorts of hints at, and what they're talking about really is corporatism. The reason they don't call it corporatism, in my opinion, is the corporate state was the title of Benito Mussolini's book. Probably, but Germany openly admits it. Japan, I mean, you know, Japan certainly, no way you can call Japan a free market economy. That you have the Ministry of International Trade and MIDI, it's called. I mean, they set prices. You know, they tell Toshiba, we'll eliminate your prices, we'll cut your taxes in half for 5 years, so you can penetrate the American market and grab market share, and then we'll raise your taxes back up and we'll lower the taxes on Toyota. I mean, they do it all the time. Americans scream and yell, they're ringing the market, and the Japanese go, well, yeah. Germans do it.
Well, they also set limits on income. So, like, your C-suite can only make a certain percentage above what the lowest paid worker.
Yeah, and I don't know, Dan, I don't know if that is an integral part. I mean, you're right, they do that. I don't know if that is essential. Okay? But, I mean, but there's other, I mean, it's been 1987, okay? And the fact of the matter is, since 1987, there's not been a country in the world that's reduced, has achieved, you know, sustainability. By any measure that you want to use.
So with the rate we're going, how many years does the planet have left?
You know,
Well, let's get over to the radical.
I'm gonna get my dog.
let's get over let's get over to the radicals. Yeah, because there's a big shift here. The biggest shift, I think the first big shift, is with ecological economics. God, I tried for, 19 years? To try to explain the difference between environmental economics and ecological economics. Environmental economics is mainstream economics. Talks about internalizing the externalities, but basically keeping the pro-growth capitalist system working. Ecological economics goes back to John Stuart Mill and says at some point you've got to move from a progressive economy to a stationary economy, to a no-growth economy. Okay. That's a big change. It would require basically three things. One, a scaling and a stopping the growth in the increasing production of goods and services. And let me say, obviously I can't discuss this all, but if you want, I can, they're doing a lot of work on this at the Gun Institute. The University of Vermont is probably the best place. There's books that have been written to spell out the specific policies and issues. The biggest name here is Herman Daly. Herman Daly and Joshua Farley at Gun have produced a terrific book. But anyway, first thing you do is stabilize goods and services. Get rid of GDP. GDP measures nothing. Okay, it's a crappy measure for not much stuff. Switch to something like the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, in which case we've been going downhill for about the past 30 years. And then the second thing you have to do, and this is going to be the tough thing, you've got to deal with population growth.
Absolutely.
A planet of 7.5 billion people is probably unsustainable at whatever level of affluence. And then the third was the one Dan comes up with. You're going to have to do something about what wealth is created. How are you going to distribute it? Now, under a capitalist system, it's easy. You know how to distribute wealth. Everybody gets more.
Well, that's not working too well.
No. In fact, as growth rates now stagnate well below 3% of this bad measurement. No, I've heard what I think is a great little piece. The other ways, how can you distribute income? One, everybody gets more. Two, everybody gets what they were born with. Mm-hmm. Three, everybody gets what they can steal from somebody else. Or four, everybody gets the same. Options one, everybody gets more, is no longer valid. I am not a communist. I do not want everybody to make the same. If I work hard and go to school, and struggle, I think I deserve to get more. Well, that leaves everybody gets what they were born with, and there's a name for that system, it's called feudalism. And everybody gets what they can take from somebody else, there's a name for that. Who is it? I forget what his name is. He calls it a kleptocracy, the rule by the thieves. But it's class warfare, right? Now I think we're giving mouth service to everybody gets more, but in fact America's closely moving towards some sort of feudal system and a kleptocracy. There's a fifth alternative, and this is what ecological economics suggests. You set a floor on income. This, by the way, the idea for this is Richard Nixon's, all right? And basically do away with all welfare programs, and you just have a revenue system. Is if you made less than this amount, you get paid. Okay, and then here's the toughie: you set an upper limit.
Now the bottom, is that earned income, like the earned income tax plan?
The earned income credit is similar to it. I'm blanking on the name. That Nixon called it, but
The negative income tax?
yeah, I think you might. It was something like that, wasn't it? The negative income tax? Yes. Yeah. And you said, set it at say $10,000, which by the way, I did my taxes. I'm below that. And then you set up an upper limit. And who does this? The society does this. Unless, I'm going to be generous. Let's say, what? $10 million a year?
That's generous.
How about $1 million a month? 12 million. If you can't live on $12 million a year, you need to get on a budget. All right? And we just say, there's the range. You work hard, you go to school, you defer your gratification. You can make more than 10,000, but nothing you do is going to let you make about 12 million. And if you think that sounds generous, there are plenty of hedge fund operators that are making a heck of a lot more than that. I saw one figure, the average hedge fund operator is making $1 million a day.
In the wrong career.
No, well, or the right one, I'm not sure, but I mean, that's how you deal with distribution. You set floors, ceilings, let them fluctuate in between. Okay.
That's never gonna happen.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Japan's doing it. I mean, it's amazing. Compare the salary and benefits of the chairman of GM and the chairman of Toyota. The chairman of Toyota doesn't make 1/50th what the GM president does.
Yeah, but it's not America. That's America is.
Well,
The barbarians at the
stand by.
Well, we're very different.
Yeah, let's stand by for that.
Yeah.
All right, stand by for that. So, ecological economics needs to be studied. I mean, is an alternative. If we could get your point is well taken. The biggest problem with ecological economics is not would it work. All right. This will not work. Free market capitalism will not work. You cannot have exponential growth on a finite planet. But it's practical. Because it's in practice. This would work. Your issue is, could we ever get it put into practice here?
Well, when we had the graduated income tax before Reagan came in, I mean, it was sort of like that. But you had rates going up 70–80%.
Yeah.
So it's sort of.
No, I agree. I mean, I think I said last week, the three biggest issues in 2016, climate change, human population growth, and income distribution, income equity. Those are the three big issues, and I guarantee you the Democrats and Republicans will not discuss any of them.
Corporate personnel.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, we'll have that, we already had that one. Like, ecological economics. The problem with ecological economics is how do you get to it, all right? And the issue is all these people remain highly anthropocentric. They're humanist. I mean, why are we going to do? Why do we need to make that change? We need to make that change in order to save the damn planet. And the planet deserves to be saved. Why aren't we going to make that change? I'll tell you why we're not going to make the change. Because we don't care. And why don't we care? Because we're humans. We think that this was all done for this. Daly remains a solid Christian. They are, we're doing that. Anything we do for human beings. Sir.
Could you just repeat again some of the main tenets of the ecological economics?
The main tenet is to move towards a steady state, no growth economy.
Okay.
The three policy recommendations, broad policy areas, all right, is moving towards a no increase in goods and services. They want to jump GDP, but basically throughput. You've had this. Throughput through the input of goods and services would be down to zero. That and there's subsets to that. Well, how do you achieve that? And the answer is, once again, they got systems, policies, and taxes and stuff. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to heavily tax non-renewables. You're going to subsidize renewables and recyclables. Okay, and basically through their policy, and they get quite specific. Through their policy jiggling, you move towards something very close to a recycled alternative energy economy. That's step one. Step two is dealing with population. And in America, that means dealing with immigration. And that's going to be a toughie, because the liberals are going to fight you tooth and nail on it, I think. And the third one is dealing with income distribution. How do you distribute what wealth the society does create? And they do that by their floor and ceiling system.
Well, I've heard that immigration is really helpful when you're talking about population control. Because there's a lot, especially in the U.S., when there's this worry about the older group cohort just getting large, and who's going to be supporting. So
but that argument assumes perpetual growth. The way we take care of more elderly is to have more young.
Yeah.
And then when those young grow up, we got to have more young to keep them going. It doesn't answer the fundamental question. At some point, it starts to. Right? But good point. Right? The second one, social ecology. I keep talking about it. I think I'm the only person in America that still does. Social ecology says that the basic source of our problems is we humans want to dominate and control the planet. And the reason we do is because we see that as the solution to every problem. Terrorism attack us, our first response is, who are we going to bomb? Okay? I would drop this except the major spokesman for social ecology is Murray Bookchin. And Murray Bookchin, very, very cerebral, very, very esoteric, but it's a lot of Hegel, and it's a lot of it's evolution, it's social evolution, it's social Darwinism, but it's left-wing social Darwinism as opposed to right-wing social Darwinism. And he sees societies as evolving. This is your question of how are we going to change. He sees societies evolving, and this competitive, cutthroat, high-consumption society, it's a stage. And that beyond that, the next step
is heaven.
No, well, for most of us. The next step socially is to move towards a society where there is not this goddamn rat race. There's a price to be paid for this. I've heard statistics that one out of every 3 Americans is on an antidepressant. Suicide is the 9th largest cause of death in this country. The rat race. I mean, you know, what high school is going to get gunned down this afternoon? The rat race is causing not only an ecological toll, it's causing a tremendous psychological toll. The shop till you drop, you know.
That's Hamilton, though.
Oh,
Well, thank you, Frank, Professor Frank.
you know, what comes after that? Now, for conservatives, for the neocons, for people like Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History, he says, this is it. We have reached the end of history. High consumption, high technology capitalism. America, there is no further way for social evolution to take place. We know. Heaven is the next step. Heaven is now. This is it. We are living in heaven. All right? Bookchin's interesting because Bookchin says, no, there's another step. This is not the end. Now, how we're going to make that step, we might talk about. But the next step, let's talk about the next step in social evolution. All right, let's talk about getting rid of this damn Christian ethic of work. Well, I'll tell you what. One of my experiences of working at Warren was Presbyterians. Whew, are they hung up on work? I mean, they're good Calvinists, you know. I kind of like. I think a better world would be one that, from a perspective, we'd say is a lot more lazy. People would spend more time canoeing, reading books, writing poetry,
Napping.
training dogs. You know.
I hear a platform.
My problem. Vote for Frank. He's chilled out and thinks you should. But Bookchin remains an ardent humanist. He has no truck with, quote, nature lovers.
He has no truck.
Yeah, with nature lovers. Tree huggers. He hates them.
Oh, okay.
We're doing this
For people.
for people,
No.
okay?
So there's no cycle.
Yeah, no. In fact, this is why it's evolutionary. It's down here in nature. I mean, you know, people. These were savages. We are becoming more, and the reason we're going to do this is because we are going to be more and more rational. We are nature capable of thinking of itself. And sooner or later, the one thing that all these things have in common is they're fundamentally irrational. Okay? And I think this is Bookchin's, it's not certainly in the Christian faith. I taught with Murray Bookchin up at Goddard. But it's a faith, he has a profound faith in human rationality. If we come to understand that it's destruction of the environment, it's the destruction of the planet, or changing our ways. Yeah, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. And there's going to be a technological component. He was big into alternative technology, but it's going to be small scale. It's going to be decentralized. Our politics is going to be decentralized. We're going to move back to some sort of a community-based. We're going to be living in little communes, consuming less, growing more, putting our genius to work on how to produce, small head hydro plants.
Sounds like kumbaya time here.
It's, it's the next step, it's the next step in social evolution.
Sounds like it's back to the sixties, though.
Well, I mean, he was very big and very ardent in the '60s. Sure, yeah, it is, and I mean, believe me, compared to Goddard College when I was at Goddard made Warren Wilson look like Caltech, Liberty University. I mean, I gotta tell a story. We walked, no grades, no tests, no courses. You go through the cafeteria, and they had rolled marijuana joints they were in the dessert section, in case you were wondering.
Next to the brownies.
Yeah. Looking back, when you get old, you look back, I realize it was like, that was a remarkable 2 years of my life. I don't ever want to do it again, but it was.
Did you remember?
Opened your eyes.
Parts.
Well, how do you spell his name, his last name?
Bookchin. Murray Bookchin. Now, let me say this. Murray Bookchin is one of the few people I've met in my life that I will swear was a bona fide genius. I mean, he wasn't just smart. He knew he had written books on the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, ecology. I mean, Murray Bookchin. He was the biggest pain in the ass you'd ever want to meet. He needed a personality transplant talking about technology.
You can't have everything.
That's true. He became. Murray didn't believe in weddings, but his partner, was one of the founders of ecofeminism, which you can see ecofeminism and social ecology would have strong links. Just as humans dominate nature, men dominate women. Right? And for those that would say this can never happen, there were people that say women will never be the equals of men. It's a counter to nature. Okay? Well, maybe not so. The big shift, I think, among the radicals comes with the neo-Malthusians. These are people, obviously, as the name suggests, that focus on the population issue. And they start off, it's an interesting debate, they start off making what looks like a biological issue about carrying capacity and how many people it can have. And it slowly morphs into an ethical element where should we care about any species besides ourselves? Suppose, for instance, if we got rid of all the domesticated animals, get rid of all the cattle, right? All become vegetarians. We could support a lot more people. I dare say that's true. Of course, that means once we got rid of them, there'd be no point in having cows, sheep, so we could support more people who got rid of all the get rid of those dogs. There's dogs and cats. In fact, I listen to them and it's like, eventually we're going to have a world of soybeans and people. And it's like, I'm not saying that's not possible, but it's not a world I want to live in.
Two of my least favorite things.
Tofu and people.
Yeah, yuck. So they begin with this notion about population, but it ends up being a notion about ethics. How many people should we have on this planet and still have a diverse ecosystem? Still have some wild nature out there, Still have some fish that weren't raised in hatcheries. Still have some ducks that didn't come from a pen on the other side of the fence. And here, these people really differ from these people because of an issue, and you brought this up, so I want to spend a couple minutes, called the demographic transition.
I meant it, but.
What's the difference between mainstream sustainable development and the neo-Malthusians? And this is the difference. Mainstream sustainable development argues that as societies become more affluent, as children become less of a necessity to hoe the crops and things, as women become more educated and move into the workplace, then their population drops, or their fertility rates go down, and their population stabilizes. So Fareed Zakaria was one who was saying, what we need in the third world nations is more economic growth. Economic growth is the best contraception you can have. Now, part of that I agree with. I mean, the best contraception you can have is a college degree for women, all right? And I'm all in favor of that. But the difference is this. Environmental impact is a function of population, but it's also a function of the affluence of that population. How much are they consuming per capita? And it's also a function of the technology. Are you having a throwaway economy, or are you having a recyclable economy? So the Democrat, to say that more economic growth produces fewer people is true, but more economic growth may produce fewer people and actually increase your impact. The difference between the neo-Malthusians, am I making sense here? The difference between the neo-Malthusians and the mainstream sustainable development people is the mainstream believes in the demographic transitions, how you handle population. The neo-Malthusians say the demographic transition doesn't work because of this. You're trading population for affluence. What is the most overpopulated country in the world?
China. India.
Indonesia. If you're just counting numbers, you say China, India, Indonesia. But if you add I equals population times affluence, and you've got to see this, the most overpopulated country in the world is the United States of America. Every new American, because every one of us, average Americans, consumes in their lifetime about the resources of about 40 third world people. So, to
And
get
it's still complaining.
yeah, and we're still complaining, yeah. So, that's why we're 4% of the world's population. We're consuming 25% of the world's resources. So whether or not you can, these people say no. The demographic transition will not solve it. You need a population policy, which means, first of all, you need to set a target. This is how you make policy. You need to set a target. What is going to be the population of the United States? David Pimentel, noted ecologist at Cornell, says the sustainable population of the United States is about 200 million. And then you need to set policies to get there. Enforce it. Now, we've tried that before. India tried it, China tried it, and there was a lot of difficulty and a lot of oppression that went along with that. So this is going to be this is going to get us into the issue of ethics. This gets us into what do you do with the Mormon that says, I want 13 children?
Cap and trade.
I'm going to listen all what do you do with
All right, Max, you're shut down.
One of the things you do, you got to stop Americans. You got to stop this. The American population keeps growing. We're one of the fastest growing populations of any industrial country, and what's causing it is obvious to everybody. It's immigration. We've got to stop this flood of illegal immigrants, and that's going to require two things. Well, three things. It's going to require tougher border security. This is where my liberal friends are starting. We need that fence. I put in a 30-yard minefield. We need the only way you're gonna get a pass is you're gonna have some form of amnesty and a path to citizenship for those that have been here for a while. And third, you've got to have a rigorous system of deportation. You can't let somebody sneak across this border and tell them that as soon as you cross, you're gonna get to the back of the line for pathway to citizenship. If you do that, that's open border.
Why not get the males that come over that sentence?
I would be willing, I would be willing to entertain that.
They would.
Yeah, I would be willing, and the women to litigation, I would be willing, I'd be willing to accept that. That's not the biggest problem I have is with the 15th Amendment. What do you do with the, this woman's pregnant in Mexico, gets on a plane, flies into LA, has a baby, boom, that baby, 15th Amendment, is an American citizen. And we're not gonna repeal the 15th Amendment, nor would I want to. But what do you do about the argument of breaking up families?
Still back on your equation. I think that's gonna need a little work in your book there to make that understandable.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the U.S., I mean, surely impact, you have to divide that by the amount of land in the country to get some kind of understanding.
Yeah.
Of what the impact is per unit of land or something like that.
Yeah, that could probably be part of the T here, yeah, certainly. Increased population in Britain would have a much heavier, but increased population in Congo would have, not nearly as increased population as Americans. I just think it's important to note that it's not strict. I mean, when I ask a question, what's the most overpopulated country in the world, the normal answer that you get is India, Indonesia, China. But when you ask what nations are having the biggest impact per capita, right? But your question, and I've seen one figure. It was like, how many acres? Your issue of land. This has been done. How many acres does it take to support an American? And the answer is, it's like twice as many acres as we have in this country. James Madison did the math and said, when is this country going to get filled up? And he said 1929. But, what percentage of food that Americans consume is grown in another country?
You count California as another country.
I went to school there. You can make a strong case. But even then, most, what percentage of our, we know about, at least the last figures I saw, 40% of our oil comes from other countries.
So 50% of our food? 50% of our food?
I don't know. Come on.
I don't think it's anywhere near 50%, but it's a big number.
It's a big number.
Oh, it's like
Of food.
produce.
Of food.
Look at produce.
Yeah. What's that one? The average McDonald hamburger has the meat from like 10 different cows in it.
Different countries.
And different countries.
Yeah. That's another reason I do.
The question then becomes how to do this ethical shift. Oops. And the next one are the bioregionalists. The bioregionalists are an interesting group. On the surface, they seem to be just normal, like we're farmers, we want to take care of, we're going to plant local stuff and etc. They're the folks up in Madison County, and yet underneath of it, I think there's a subversion of the ethics because they're changing from the individualism to a more of a community based. They're moving more from the anthropocentrism. They talk a lot about the land. And the land is more than an agricultural commodity for them, I think. It's an emotional attachment to a sense of, you can love a mountain. And it's that notion of, this is Aldo Leopold, it's that notion of love and respect. I can love a goose even while I draw my shotgun. In fact, I draw my shotgun on it because I love it. That's the beginning of the shift, I think. And there's a lot of work being done. Now, there's a lot of work being done on this. Bill Vitek suggesting, the University of Kentucky Press now has a special unit, a special series just on the agrarian, and this ties in with, I mean, this is part of American culture. This is agrarian populism. If you could get the Tea Party to get rid of this damn pro-capitalism libertarianism and start realizing their true roots in American populism, this is in many ways a part of the Occupy Wall Street.
And having just lived in the Northwest for a couple of months, there's a big movement called Cascadia, where it's the bioregion of Oregon, Washington, and like the panhandle of Idaho and southern Vancouver, Canada.
Yeah.
And it's, the whole idea is basically we're good. We got plenty of rain. We've got clean soil for the most part, and we have fish that come in. We can grow our own food, and you know, we want to create our like an independence movement around just this area.
Yeah. The last one is deep ecology. Deep ecology has both a philosophical wing that studies, you know, this, and a more activist wing of protest, sabotage. This is ecotage. The philosophical wing is that says that basically humans are on a deeply pathological course. Now what we see, that what we're doing to the environment is just a outward reflection of what we're doing to ourselves. We've lost our sense of who we are, where we're going, where we came from. Paul Shepard, boy, read some stuff by Paul Shepard. Paul Shepard says, he is a cognitive psychologist, among other things. He says, what we are, look at us. We are a perfect example of a stage of human evolution called adolescence. We are a nation of adolescents. What do adolescents want? They want more, 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 no limits. Don't ask me to clean up my room. Okay? Don't tell me there's something I can't do. And it's all about me, me, me. It's possible, I think, to grow up. What America needs, the most basic policy, obviously you're looking at a very committed deep ecologist. The basic thing Americans need to do is just grow up. God, the Charlotte or somebody's putting on Peter Pan. I wanted to make a movie called Peter Pan Must Die. No, you are going to grow up, Peter Pan. Somebody needs to put a bullet in Tinkerbell, or at least a fly swat.
That is not a campaign slogan.
Grow up, recognize limits. Frank, you're not going to become a major league ball player. There are limits. There are limits, each of us, and the limits are okay. Learning, I mean, that's learning to live with the things you can and can't do is what it means to be an adult.
There was a hedge fund manager who had written a book about it. He had weaned himself off of it, but he was saying that the money was so addictive, you don't need it. You know, the amount that you're getting is obscene, but it was so addictive, and no matter how obscene it was, no matter how many people disliked you for having that much money, when you went into a restaurant, people catered to you, they were all admiration was
You're a rock
flowing.
star.
Right.
You're a rock star. Who doesn't want to be a rock star? What adolescent doesn't want to be a rock star? You know, I mean, we worship people, we admire people who are even more immature than we are.
And are getting away with it.
I'm getting away with it. That's the difference. The difference isn't their level of maturity. The difference is they're getting away with it.
So what does it take to change? The only change that I have seen come about is crisis.
Well, every day I confess I pray for the stock market to crash.
Oh my God.
Now that I got out. Every day, I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, if this is, part of me says, go ahead, Al Qaeda, touch off a nuke in New York City. And then part of me says, I don't really believe that. I got friends living in New York. Part of me says,
an awfully
I mean,
big adjustment.
look, I spent 40 years of my life trying to be convinced that humans can be persuaded by rational arguments and scientific evidence. At least once a week, I went to bed thinking, you know, Frank, maybe that's bullshit. Maybe they need to, you know, maybe the only thing that changes them is a good stock market crash, a good nuclear war.
It seems like crisis is the thing that
Yeah,
causes paradigm shifts.
Well, and this is, you know, this is now, don't miss May's thrilling lecture. How does this all fit into the American Constitution?
Oh,
James Madison says, we just limited government, do nothing, don't deal with a problem, and don't deal with a problem until, you know, till you have to. And Alexander Hamilton says, yes, but when the emergencies come along, the power all shifts to Washington and it all shifts to the White House. And we can have a, I think Roosevelt probably dealt with the Depression. As much, you know, Lincoln certainly dealt with the Civil War. He became a dictator.
who are some of the other deep ecologists that you recommend, since you're, aside from you and
Paul Shepard. John Robin was my dissertation advisor. Oh man, yeah, he wrote mostly articles. I should bring you some. Read Ed Abbey. Go home tonight.
Oh, yeah.
Go get a copy of Sand Cow. Get a copy of Desert Solitaire. Get out of Leopold's Sand County Almanac. When he talks about the moral responsibility, talks about nature as part of our ethical community.
What about Joanna Macy?
Don't know her.
She's coming from a spiritual.
Well, that's interesting. Now, some people call it ecofeminism. Some, you know, this is ecological romanticism. All right, taking romanticism out as a bad term. This is a real split. This is a real split in the feminist movement between the social eco-feminists who want nothing to do with romanticism, and then these people who are deeply see nature as spiritual. That's, I mean, do not get between them.
I would say too that Wilma Dykeman, in her writing,
Okay.
and in the topics that she chose,
Okay.
in the 50s and 60s,
Mhm,
talked
mhm.
about population, she talked about the use of GMOs and the use of pesticides to go create a small family business to go to an international corporation. She spoke about race relations, and she spoke about the economy being driven by a clean environment and a healthy cycle.
Was that
This
before
woman-
Silent Spring?
Yes, 7 years before Silent Spring. The woman was brilliant.
Maybe this is could be a facetious question in a way, but, the last few days on the news, there's been this incident in Nevada with you know about?
No, I don't, please.
Oh, the
Okay,
nuclear waste?
well, no, there's a group.
Cowboy.
There's a group,
Oh, yeah.
and there's one man who did not pay his cattle grazing fees to the government, and he now owes them $1 million. And they sent him a bill. And he said, well, I'm not paying. And I don't know exactly the details of, did they show up at his house, I'm not sure, but
They
I
did.
do know that hundreds, if not thousands, of gun-toting supporters have shown up. And their
In
pictures.
his support.
Yeah, in his
Yeah.
support, and there are pictures of their aiming their weapons at the federal marshals.
I'm not gonna come out of the closet, I've been an anarchist for most of my life. But there's a difference between, what the reason for my anarchism is, I want the government to stop doing all that. I also want them to quit protecting the corporations and the banks.
But wait a minute, you gotta understand, just so you don't misunderstand.
Yeah.
The government gives cattlemen
Grazing.
a super deal.
Oh,
on the
super
grazing.
deal, super deal,
You
yeah.
know, 1/10 the cost of
Super
private
deal,
land.
yeah.
And still, in spite of that,
Oh, yeah.
this guy refuses to pay.
Oh, yeah, that's this.
Or could he having, and he's an old man, he's probably having some dementia as well. You know, you have to factor these
Surrounded
things
by-
in, it's not like he's a normal person.
I'd like to say a few
at certain
words
point.
about, in favor of old men that are having dementia.
Not everyone.
Listen, that was great, I enjoyed that. Don't miss May's,
May what?
May what,
16th.
which is not a holiday. Are there any holidays in May?
May
Oh my God, I
16th,
hope not.
Huh?
16.
May 16th.
May 16th.
Tell your friends.
Tell your friends
If you
we're gonna
missed
do.
prior ones, you can look at the RiverLink YouTube station and get them online, and
Is that Wednesday?
that's
No,
Friday.
Friday.
They're always Friday. We figure everybody, well, we are anyway, we're brain dead by 3 o'clock on Friday. We need to do some shit here.
Huh?
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.